We are live. Should go live any moment. And there we are. Okay, so we are live. Hello, everyone. Okay, let me just start. Yeah. Okay, we are live. Can someone confirm on YouTube chat that they can see us well? Let's see if someone can at least acknowledge. Hello. Hey, Ujjwal. Hi, Amir. Hey, Rohit. Hi, Amir. Hi, Praveen. Hi, Sharad. Okay, so that's good. People can see us.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third virtual MuleSoft meetup event. For those who are joining us for the first time, this is an online meetup group for MuleSoft community. Our plan here is to have live presentations from amazing speakers all around the world. And since it is live, you can join us from any corner of the world. I don't know, maybe you can join us from the International Space Station too. If they have internet and allow watching YouTube from there, maybe you can. But yeah, anyway. So my name is Manik Magar. I am a technical architect at Avio Consulting, where we focus on MuleSoft based solutions. I will be your host for today. Our guest is one of the best contributor, I would say, in MuleSoft community, Joshua Ernie. Hi, Josh.
Hey,
Hey.
Thanks for having
me. Yeah. So he has written some amazing blog posts on his personal blog, journey.io, and I'm sure most of you have already read those blogs. So today here, he is going to talk about functional programming concepts for DataWeave 2.0. So before I hand it over to Josh, one last thing I want to mention about question and answers. So you should see a live YouTube chat on right half of the page, either this side or this side. One of the side on YouTube, you should see that YouTube chat. Feel free to ask your questions or any comments on that on that chat. We will get to those question answers once Josh finishes his presentation. And for the first time today, what we are going to try is at the end of the presentation, I will share an Hangout link for you guys on the chat. So if you have a simple question, just try to ask that question on YouTube chat itself. But if you have something bigger discussion point, or if you want to join in for the talking session, you can try joining that Hangout session, and you will be connected to video as well as audio. It's your choice. There may be limit. This is the first time we are trying, so there may be limit on the number of participants that can join on the Hangout. So I request you to join and be there as needed. For some reason, if you cannot join Hangout, just fall back to our old YouTube live chat, which is always there. So I think with that, Josh, I will give stage to you.
All right.
The all is yours.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation. First of all, thank you again for having me. I've been looking forward to this for actually ever since you asked me to do it, so I'm really excited to be here. Let me go ahead and bring this up. And all right, everyone can see my screen okay? Oh, I'll need to hear it from Manique.
Yeah,
because I don't think you can see it. Okay?
Yeah, I can see it, and it's being on the screen, so that's good.
All right, awesome. So I'll go ahead and get started.
Yep.
So this talk is about DataWeave 2.0. All the concepts here will apply to DataWeave 1.0 as well. So if you're using Mule 3 instead of Mule 4, you don't need to worry about that. The topic of this talk is called Language Fundamentals. My name is Joshua Ernie. I'm an integration engineer at Mountain State Software Solutions. I blog at journey.io. You can find my LinkedIn below that. That's usually where I do most of my correspondence. And this Twitter handle at the bottom there, Mule Made Easy, is a project that I've started up with my friend Jose to basically build tutorials and educational content around MuleSoft products. So if you get the chance, you can check us out there as well. So the agenda for this presentation, first, we're just going to do an introduction. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. We'll talk about what DataWeave is. We'll go over the language fundamentals, which is the core of the talk. I'll go over some practical tips on how you can kind of solidify your understanding of these fundamentals and how you can apply them to your code. I have a section for additional information in case you have the desire to follow up on some kind of information that I'm not putting in the talk. So that'll be stuff like books that you can read and things like that. And then at the end, like Monique was saying, we'll break for questions. So who am I and why should you listen to me, of all people? I've been programming since 2011. It was something I decided I wanted to do later in college. I'm not bragging about it. I know that a lot of people have a lot more experience than I have. Started with Java, moved into Python, and then later JavaScript. And then later, I got into some more esoteric languages. I found out that programming languages were something that I was really passionate about. So I started dipping my toe into like Lisp and languages like Clojure and Racket, as well as Scala and Ruby. I've been working with MuleSoft products for about 3 years now. So when I first started at MS3, I didn't notice that there were any DataWeave experts at my company or in the community, which wasn't really surprising now that I look back at it, because DataWeave was just replacing Data Mapper at that time. So I think a lot of people were a little apprehensive about diving headfirst into DataWeave because they were afraid it was going to be replaced. I used the language for a couple months and kind of came to the conclusion that DataWeave was so incredibly good at the task that it was designed to do that MuleSoft would be crazy to get rid of it. So I just dove headfirst into it. Love learning about programming languages, so I decided that's where my focus was going to be. So when I started learning the DataWeave language, this was about the same time that functional programming started to make sense to me. And we'll talk more about functional programming later, but this was when I was coming off of doing a lot of functional JavaScript. That's when I started doing DataWeave and kind of put 2 and 2 together. A brief disclaimer, I don't work for MuleSoft and I've never seen the source code for DataWeave. I just mention this because I have no way of knowing with 100% certainty how the language actually works. Because DataWeave is just a complete black box to me. So what I'm going to be covering today is more of the mental model that I've built up over the last 3 years that represents how I think the language works. So what I'm going to be describing might not be actually how it works, but it should be an effective model for you to use when you're creating solutions in that language. So just keep that in mind. All right, so just real briefly, in case anybody's relatively new to MuleSoft, let's talk about what DataWeave is. So DataWeave is a domain-specific language created specifically to optimize data transformations. And this is regardless of the source and target formats. If you've used DataWeave before, you know that if you're transforming something from CSV to JSON or JSON to CSV, the only changes that you need to make to the code are related to the shape of that particular data format. And what I mean by that is you don't need to worry about what parsers you're using and how you're serializing and deserializing the data, establishing canonical models, because essentially DataWeave is your canonical model. So you don't need to worry about any of that kind of stuff. DataWeave is a fully fledged programming language. I think it's important to recognize that and kind of respect the language for what it is. I think it's easy to kind of put DataWeave into a box and say that it's just, a very specific tool for doing a very specific thing. And while it is that, you really got to put in the same amount of time and dedication to learn it as you would a language like Java, because it is a fully fledged programming language. Luckily, there are less concepts to learn, so you can learn it faster, but the point still stands. And lastly, DataWeave adheres to the core tenets of functional programming. Like I said earlier, we're going to go over that. That's essentially the core of the talk. So why should you learn DataWeave? As an honest answer, you don't really have a choice anymore. Since Mule 4 came out, they've adopted DataWeave as their expression language as well. If you're not familiar with the Mule expression language from Mule 3, that was basically used so that you could configure components, put small scripts like putting in a conditional expression for a choice router or something like that. So that's been replaced by the DataWeave expression language, and obviously we're still using DataWeave to do the large majority of our data transformation heavy lifting. Like I mentioned earlier, with DataWeave, you don't need to concern yourself with parsing and deserializing your data. At this point, you don't even have to worry about getting it into Java anymore. With Mule 4, you can take in a JSON payload from HTTP and modify it directly. Because DataWeave does all this parsing and deserialization and serialization for you, you need a lot less code to perform your data transformations. And this is not only true because you don't have to do the parsing, etc., but it's also kind of a side effect of using functional programming languages. They can just typically get more done with less code in most cases. It's not always true. And lastly, and this is probably the most important thing, which is why I put it in bold, the programming concepts that you're going to learn to effectively use DataWeave are going to make you a better programmer, especially if you're not familiar with them already. So the goal of this talk is to give you an introductory understanding of those concepts. So this is a tweet I saw recently from Paul Graham. This was, November 3rd. A simple rule I taught my 9-year-old today: if you can't figure something out, you figure out how to figure it out. When I first started learning DataWeave, there wasn't any information regarding the core language concepts. So what I essentially did was found languages that were similar to DataWeave. I relatively quickly identified DataWeave as a functional programming language, and I started learning the functional concepts through the other languages, like I was saying, like JavaScript, Scala, and Clojure. And once I had a good handle on these concepts, that's when I started sharing these ideas with my company, and I started sharing these later with the public as well. A question I hear a lot regarding DataWeave is why not Java? And I think this is a very legitimate question because Java is what Mule is built on. Like the Mule runtime is built on Java. So why not just extend Java and like use a specific subset of Java to do all of our transformations? So let's address that real quick. First of all, the scope of Java is relatively massive compared to DataWeave. DataWeave is, like I was saying earlier, a domain-specific language. It's designed to do one thing very well, whereas Java is designed to do pretty much anything you can do with a programming language decently well. Java is object-oriented, and this is great for designing large-scale solutions like the Mule runtime, but it is not very good for designing hundreds of tiny data transformations. One of the reasons people bring up Java is because it does have some support for functional programming languages, like Java 8 streams, but it seems to do so rather reluctantly. Keep in mind that there was years and years and years behind Java building it up as an object-oriented programming language, and then recently in Java 8, they decided to slap on some functional programming things. Whereas DataWeave is built from the ground up to utilize these concepts to their fullest potential. In addition, Java is pretty verbose. You deal with a lot of boilerplate code, and when most of the scripts that we write are like 20 to 25 lines long, you don't want 50% of that code to be boilerplate. It just kind of muddies things up, and it makes it difficult to understand what the transformation is doing. So in that way, DataWeave kind of gets out of your way and just lets you write the transformation code. All right, so now to the core of the talk. This is language fundamentals. This is the hard part in parentheses for a few reasons. I'm going to be going over these concepts in a very introductory way. For some people, these functional programming concepts click very quickly, but for some people, they don't. For example, it probably took me like a year and a half I think, of on and off learning to really internalize what these concepts meant and how to use them. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you have any questions while I'm going through these, just make sure you write them down, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to address all of them. So first things first, if you're only going to learn one thing from this webinar, and I've already said it multiple times, it's that DataWeave is a functional programming language. Like I was referencing in that tweet earlier, there's not a lot of great content on there, great content out there on the internet that talks about DataWeave being a functional programming language. But once you identify it as such, that really gives you the ability to kind of take your learning into your own hands and learn more about functional programming in general and how it relates back to DataWeave. So what is functional programming? Functional programming is a programming paradigm like procedural or object-oriented. And let's talk about what that means very briefly. So in an object-oriented programming language like Java, the object is really the main like computational focus. When you're working with Java, you're calling objects from objects. That's the main way you get things. In a functional language, you're really calling functions, and that's the goal. Now, it's important to realize that a lot of these languages more fully support some paradigms than others. Like there's usually a spectrum. You very rarely see a language that, or I shouldn't say I don't think there is a language that only supports a single paradigm. So they support some more than others. So object-oriented is supported very heavily by Java, but they support the functional side very lightly with Java streams. But they do just enough so that you can do a lot of good functional stuff with it. Where DataWeave, on the other hand, is like both feet in the in the functional programming universe. And the only real time I see it having a lot of object-oriented qualities is when it needs to interface with Java. So like, if you've ever had a DataWeave function or a DataWeave transformer that outputs Java, you'll see that it outputs a hash map or an array list or something like that. It's really just kind of there to bridge the gap. So what does Wikipedia say about functional programming? It's a programming paradigm that treats computation as the evaluation of mathematical functions and avoids changing state and mutable data. So I hope I didn't lose anybody there, because it's a boring sentence, but it contains a lot of really important information in it. In bold, mathematical functions. It's important to realize that DataWeave is using functions as opposed to using methods in Java, and that we'll get into the avoid changing state and mutable data stuff later. In the second sentence, it's a declarative programming paradigm, which means that programming is done with expressions and declarations instead of statements. This is much more easily shown by examples, so we'll get into that as well. So let's talk about what is meant by mathematical functions briefly. Instead of calling them mathematical functions, I'm just going to call them pure functions. because they're not necessarily doing something mathematical. I know my example here is adding 2 integers, but it could just as easily be adding 2 strings. Math doesn't have a lot to do with it. So if you're thinking functional programming means that you're going to need a lot of math skills, that's just not true. So don't worry about that. So we have this function add that takes in 2 parameters, x and y, and it returns the sum of those 2 parameters. Now, when you add 1 and 1, you get 2. And then if you do it a second time, you also get 2. That's not a typo. I put it in there twice to make a point. And the point is that when you're dealing with pure functions, whenever you pass the same parameters or the same inputs, they're always going to yield the same outputs no matter what. So you can call add with 1 and 1 until the end of time, and it's always going to equal 2. That's a very, very important concept. It's also a very, very powerful concept because it means that if we built up a solution using pure functions only, our solution is entirely deterministic. And what I mean by that is, if you know what the input is, you're always going to know what the output is. It's no mystery. And this is really different from methods, which methods have the ability to modify this internal state of the object that they are associated with. So let's imagine we have a class called adder, and we make an object from that called 1, and that value that we passed in the constructor is just this internal value that when you pass in a parameter, when you call add, it'll add that value to whatever you gave it for add. So when you put in 1, it'll add 1 to its internal state, which is 1, and that comes out as 2. Now, if somebody comes along and calls adder.setValue and sets it to 2, when we call 1.add1 again, suddenly it's equal to 3. Now, this probably doesn't look crazy or strange at all if you're very, very comfortable with object-oriented programming. But imagine a situation where you're dealing with a multi-threaded environment and you have this object called 1, and other objects in this multi-threaded environment have access to that object as well. And the first thing you do is call 1.add1, and it comes back as 2. And then 5 minutes later, you call 1.add1 again, expecting it to return 2, and instead it returns 3. So you don't have that determinism that you have with pure functions. So big point here, methods don't exist in DataWeave. So this is just kind of an overview of the 3 core concepts that we're going to be going over as we pulled them out from the Wikipedia definition. So we're going to be using expressions instead of statements. Our data is immutable, and we're going to be using pure functions. So first, everything is an expression. So most programs are made up of expressions, and typically a combination of statements as well. The difference between an expression and a statement. An expression is something that evaluates to a value. For example, 1 plus 2 is going to give me back 4. If I'm concatenating the string hello and the string world, it's going to return to me hello world. If you have even like a method where it has a return, like any method that's not void as a return value, for example, when you call that, that's an expression. Now, a statement is more like a command, and it represents an action. So something like sysout print would be an example of a statement, and any method that returns void is also essentially a statement. So in short, expressions return values and statements do not. Now, there's a time and place for both of them. Statements are really good for doing things like printing, saving, and setting values, as well as I/O operations, while expressions are great for doing things like calculations and transformations. And when you look at it in that context, and we'll kind of talk more about how it's good at doing these transformations. But since expressions are great for doing calculations and transformations, it starts to make sense why we're using a functional programming language for our data transformations instead of using something like Java. So what this means for DataWeave is that everything except variable and function declarations return something. And this has a profound effect on the way that you write your code. If you've ever tried to, I remember when I was first learning DataWeave, I was trying to debug a map operation that I was doing, and if I was trying to do it in Java, I would have a for loop, and I would just print out values to the console in the for loop. But there's no way to only print out values in DataWeave because it doesn't return anything. So I couldn't just throw in some kind of print statement in the middle of my map function and expect it to work. And then I later found out about the log function, which kind of gets around this in a clever way. What you do with log is you pass it a string, which is the prompt that you'll see in the console, and then you pass it the value that you want to log to the console, and it logs it to the console, but then returns the value. So log is an expression, but it's also printing to the console. So just kind of a clever way they got around that. Everything is an expression. So if on our left side here, we have a Java statement. So we have Boolean, we're setting even equal to true, and we're setting an integer equal to 0. If even, then x is equal to 2, and if it's not, then x is equal to 0. The important thing here is that that statement doesn't return, because that's kind of a redundant statement, but it's important to point out, because when you look at how DataWeave does this same thing, they look very, very similar, but they're completely different. So on DataWeave, on the right-hand side here, we have even is equal to true, and then we can just immediately set x to if even 2, else 1, because that returns. It's going to return 2 every time. So one of the things I actually really liked when and otherwise in DataWeave 1, one of the reasons is that it's not exactly the same as if and else. You looked at it and you could see that there was just something a little bit different about it, and it kind of urged you to look more into it. This one I think is a little more dangerous because they look so similar. So if you're using DataWeave 3, or sorry, excuse me, DataWeave 1, and you're going to transition into 2 at some point, just keep in mind that when you're using if and else statements, or not if and else statements rather, but if you're using if and else, that they're expressions and they're going to return a value, so you can do something like this. If you're familiar with ternary expressions in Java, these are very similar to that. This is my favorite thing about expressions. Expressions can always be substituted for the value that they return. So for example, if we have this function called complex stuff, and we pass it an array and it does all kinds of crazy stuff, and we have a bug in that somewhere, and we just want to test our map code, we can actually just replace whatever complex stuff returns with a hard value, and the rest of the code will do the exact same thing. The rest of the code doesn't care. So this is a really powerful concept for you to take advantage of when you're debugging. Just keep in mind that if you have something and you're not really sure what it's returning or if it's doing it right, and you need to test other parts of your code, you can always substitute it with what you would expect it to return, and then go back to dealing with that function later. So the key point here is that there's no statements in DataWeave. So you can't perform an action that doesn't return something. So something like simply writing to the console. Remember that if we're going to write to the console, we got to use log, and that's going to return a value as well. And every logical grouping of DataWeave code returns something. you can think of a logical grouping as anything that's valid to wrap parentheses around. So you could wrap parentheses around 1 + 1, or you could have a more complicated expression like map with a filter as well, and you can wrap that in parentheses, and that's a valid expression as well. It's just combining multiple expressions to build a bigger one. Just remember that expressions can always be replaced by the value that they return. This is a really powerful concept to use when you're debugging. So the next point, objects are immutable and there's no changing state. When I'm talking about objects here in the sense of DataWeave, I don't mean objects in the object-oriented. I do mean objects in the object-oriented sense. I don't mean them in the sense like JSON, where an object is a key value pair. So just keep that in mind. So once an object is created in DataWeave, it never changes. In fact, DataWeave can't change it. It just doesn't have, it's not part of the language designed to be able to change values. And typically this is an advantage because you have way less to keep track of. If you remember my previous slide about expressions, when, or not expressions, but the previous slide when I was talking about how in a multi-threaded environment, something can change the state of the object that you're dealing with. That just can't happen when you don't have mutable data. But a question you might have is, if we are using immutable data, how does any work get done? If we're not changing the values of objects as they pass through our mule flow, then what's going on? How is any work getting done? If you look at this flow, we have an HTTP listener that's going to give us a payload, and this transform message, we're going to transform the payload somehow. And after that, I ask the question, is that our original payload? And is the original payload modified? The answer is no. So what's happening instead? What's actually happening is the payload variable is being reassigned. I put variable in quotes because payload more or less acts like a variable. When you're dealing with it, you can assign it like a variable, but it does have some special connotations within the mule message itself. So some pseudocode about what's happening here. If a payload is equal to http.getRequestData, that's just like mocking incoming data. And you do a transform message and pass it payload. You can set payload equal to what that returns. So the new payload is created from the old payload. It isn't the old payload. And this happens to the target of every DataWeave transformation. So if the target is a variable and the variable is not assigned yet, it's assigned with the value of whatever the DataWeave expression evaluates to. But if the variable is already assigned, it's reassigned to the output of the DataWeave script. And this is kind of the mental model that I use to think about how this is going on. You have your payload, you pass that payload into a transformer, and outside of that transformer, on the other side, you get a brand new shiny payload. It's deceptively simple. The key point here is to always remember that you are never modifying anything when you use DataWeave code. DataWeave code can't modify values. It can only create new ones from old ones. And it gives the illusion of modification through reassignment. That last point being very important. Okay, last part. Functions. So that seems out of place. Okay, we'll keep going. One of the things about functions you'll notice in DataWeave is that there's no return keyword. It actually doesn't need one because everything is an expression, so everything returns. So having a return keyword is kind of redundant. Functions always return the last expression in the body that's evaluated. So in this function add n plus m, it's always going to return whatever n plus m evaluates to. And it's not necessarily the same function every single time, because if you have some kind of conditional expression in there, it could return n plus m in this case, depending on the input, or it could return n, the result of n minus m. One thing that's important to note about DataWeave is that it supports higher order functions. And this is just a really fancy way of saying your functions can take other functions as input. And if you're familiar with Java at all, if you're familiar with the sort method and how you pass it a class with a single method, I don't remember what the method is called. This is akin to that. And if you're not sure about this or you feel uneasy about it, just keep in mind that you've been doing it a lot. If you've been programming with DataWeave for a while, you do it all the time with map, filter, group by, pluck, all of these powerful functions that you've been using in DataWeave are probably higher order functions. So when we look at the map function here, that last part, employee to employee.id, this is a function that gets passed to the map function. A lot of people don't think about it that way, but it's important to think about it that way if you want to write your own higher order functions later on. So understanding higher order functions, I'm going to call them HOFs from now on because it's a lot to say. So HOFs are very good at separating concerns. So if we're using our map from earlier as an example, the function map itself takes care of looping through the input array and applying the function that was passed in to each value. That's what it does. It doesn't care about what you want to do to every value, right? So the function passed to map is the one that describes how each element in the input array should actually be transformed. And what's nice about this is that you can use map for this broad range of topics. Like anytime you have a situation where you need to iterate through an array and change every value in it, that's map. But when you say that back to yourself, that's a really wide range of problems, especially as they relate to data transformation. So you have this single function that, because it doesn't specifically identify what it's going to do to every element, it has a lot of flexibility because you have to pass in that functionality yourself. So we have different kinds of functions. Not really different kinds, but they can be created in different ways. So we have named functions, which is what you've been seeing throughout this talk. We have unnamed functions, and these are called lambdas. So if you kind of look at you just define the parameters within parentheses, you give it an arrow to the right, and everything to the right of that is the function body. And it has access to whatever parameters were passed in, as well as some other parameters as well. For example, if you defined a variable outside of that particular function, like in the header of the DataWeave file, it would have access to that as well, which is important to know. And something that not everyone is aware of is that functional assignment, like we see with named functions at the top of the slide here, is just syntax sugar for lambdas assigned to a variable. So this var greeting equals name lambda is the exact same thing as doing what we had there at the top. So why do we have lambdas? Lambdas make it so it's really easy to use higher order functions. It means we don't have to use as much code. It basically allows us to use things just like we would with like primitives in Java, for example. Like just like you would pass around integers to method calls, you can pass around functions in DataWeave. It's really that flexible. So without lambdas, you see here on the left that you're defining the function. We're calling it mapping because that's how we're doing the map. And then you can reuse that function, but we're only using it once, and it's really not doing anything complicated, right? It's just adding 1 to the h. But you can do it with lambdas. You don't have to define the function beforehand, and that's kind of the benefit of the whole thing. So key point here is that functions are DataWeave's most powerful and flexible tool for building transformations. It's really important that you fully understand how they're different from Java methods. The main points being that you can pass around functions without classes, and you can assign them to variables. And also, you can do things like what we were talking about earlier with higher order functions, where you can pass functions to other functions. And by the way, you can return them as well. I just found that I don't do that very often, and I'm not very well versed in it, so I just kind of left that part out. So you can also effectively use them, or using lambdas, excuse me. So higher order functions are great for separating concerns. Like imagine if you had to write the specific code for map to loop through an array every single time. Imagine if you had to write that recursive function every time you wanted to just modify a value in a specific way, or a set of values in an array rather. So with higher order functions like map, we don't have to do that. So practical tips. So the first thing I'd recommend is to kind of settle in for the journey. It's important to accept that DataWeave is a complete programming language. It's not just kind of like a toy language or anything like that. We have a full set of tools that we can use. We can set variables, we can call functions. It has its own core library, etc. We can create our own functions and reuse them. We have all of that. So it's important to acknowledge first that it is a programming language and treat it as such. Second, accept that DataWeave is a functional programming language and that you might not know anything about functional programming yet. This probably isn't going to apply to most of you, but if it does, in order to get the most out of DataWeave, you're really going to have to learn functional programming in general, and where it's good, where it's bad, etc. And lastly, accept that there's not a lot of content out there that discusses functional programming principles as they relate to DataWeave. My blog is an exception. I talk about that kind of stuff all the time. But there's just not a lot of other information out there about this kind of thing. And the reason I say that is because if you don't, if you don't want to read my blog, I won't be offended. But the way that you would have to go about learning these functional programming concepts, the way that you could best do it most efficiently is doing it through other languages. Namely, Scala would probably be your best bet. If you're in for a weirder experience, Clojure is probably a good one as well. But I'd recommend Scala. In DataWeave, the functions are king. This is different from Java, where objects are kind of running the show. You're going to want to make sure you fully understand what pure functions are and how they're beneficial to this style of programming, where we're just basically doing transformations. You want to make sure that you understand that when you're using map, filter, and reduce, or any of those functions, that you're using higher order functions. And finally, try writing some higher order functions of your own. That I found that when you kind of take that step outside of your comfort zone and try to write some of these functions, you really start to internalize how they work and more applications for them. And finally, don't give up. It's a really hard shift for some people. I know it was for myself. There were times where I got really frustrated trying to learn these functional programming concepts, and it's funny now when I look back because the functional concepts are actually so much more simpler than the object-oriented ones. But that's just life sometimes, I guess. So take time and make sure you put in some deliberate practice. If it doesn't work with DataWeave, as in if your learning isn't going really well with DataWeave, don't worry about it. Just try it with a different language. For example, Scala, JavaScript. Keep in mind that JavaScript is kind of like Java in that it wasn't really built as a functional programming language from the start, but it also supports it much better than Java because they weren't just tacked on later. But core parts of functional programming languages like immutability are not standard in Java. They actually have libraries that that implement that as well. So if you are going to check out Java, just do a Google search on functional JavaScript, and that should turn up some good stuff. Like I said, Clojure, if you want to get weird, and if you want to get even weirder, you can give Haskell a shot. But I would actually try those in that order if you're interested in spending your time in the most efficient way. You can ask questions on the Mule forum. I say to get help from everyone besides me because I honestly didn't know there was a forum until like a week ago. So I haven't been assisting on there very much. I'm actually pretty active on Stack Overflow. So if you submit a question on Stack Overflow and tag it DataWeave, I guarantee you with 100% certainty that I'm at least going to look at it. And feel free to reach out to me if I can help. I have my LinkedIn profile linked earlier. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at MuleMadeEasy, or I have another Twitter handle that I'll get out to you later. So additional info, you can follow us on Twitter. I have a lot of good posts up there that I basically posted in a response to this particular presentation. So if you're looking for example, if you're more interested in reading about this stuff, I know some people don't learn very well by like hearing somebody talk to them. If you're interested in reading, I have a very similar blog post that covers the same topics. If you just need some practice for DataWeave, I have a series of practice exercises. That was actually one of the big issues that I had when I started learning DataWeave was how do I practice? There just weren't a lot of areas to do that. So like anytime someone asked a question in our Slack channel at MS3, like I would work on the question, a DataWeave question. And then when I got access to MuleSoft Slack and I found out they had a DataWeave channel too, for a while there, I was just answering everything I possibly could. So practice is a huge part of it. And if you're looking to get some more practice, I've got some questions up there as well. This is my blog too. You can learn how to use reduce. And if you're looking for something more advanced like pattern matching and recursion, you can check out those links as well. This is our YouTube channel, Mule Made Easy. You can check that out. And additional information. This is the these are the books and whatnot that I was telling you about. So I believe you can access all of these for free. At least I could with the links. I don't know how long they'll be available, especially that last one. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be there, but I've linked to it anyway because I was able to find it. The first one is probably my favorite introduction to functional programming languages. The first 6 chapters of Paul Graham's book on Lisp. It's an old book, and you'll probably never write any Lisp code in your life, but he just he's such a great communicator. He is better than me. So if this didn't really make sense, that'd be the first place I'd check next, unless you just have no interest in Lisp at all. Another good introduction is the first 2 chapters of Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs by Abelson, Sussman, and Sussman. This is a classic computer science textbook. I don't know if they still do it, but at MIT in their computer science program, everyone was going through structure and interpretation in their first, I think, year. It's just a fantastic book. It was written a while ago, but it's just one of those books that's so timeless. All of the lessons in there are applicable today as well. And those first 2 chapters go over functional programming really well. If you're looking for something that's way more advanced, like you want to get into hardcore functional programming for whatever reason, functional programming in Scala is probably the way to go. And I believe that's it for me. So we will go to questions, and yeah. There we go. I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was on mute. Sorry. I was hearing my own echo. So that was awesome presentation, Josh. I mean, definitely there were so many concepts that even I saw, like pure functions. I used to do all that stuff, but I never gave a thought. Yeah, that's something new. That's good. So we see some questions coming up on YouTube chat. So first question, Amir asked how to import custom Java class in DataWeave 2. And we can do like below if package is single word utils import Java utils. If my package is com.mule.utils, how to import that?
I think this is covered in the documentation. I've never done it specifically, but
yeah, but I think the syntax that he has given is a correct syntax, Amir. If you do like import Java exclamatory and then all your package name, except instead of separating them by periods or the dots, split them by double colons, which is what
right.
you are doing. Java exclamatory utils double colon then my utils, which is your class name. So that is right. Miguel is asking any concepts to think about in DataWeave that adversely affect performance.
It's hard for me to say. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I don't have any meaningful insight into what's going on underneath the covers. I can tell you that languages like Scala and Clojure that implement like these immutable data concepts do so in a very efficient way, and that I'm not exactly sure how they do it. They're basically just moving pointers around, essentially, when they're doing a lot of these. If you're like adding something onto an array or a list, for example. So they certainly have efficient ways of doing these things. I know I haven't really come across any really big performance concerns as it relates to DataWeave. And the performance concerns that I have seen are because of the way the code is structured. For example, I've seen people like nest multiple maps and are functions like map that are just looping because they're not taking into consideration that that's essentially the same thing as nesting a bunch of for loops. So I think in terms of performance and making sure that your scripts are performant, the best thing you can do is just understand how the language is working the best you can. But to directly answer your question, I haven't really found any performance issues.
Okay. So this one for Ishwar, he's asking, is there any other approach instead of giving all the fields manually in the metadata? If it is about 10 fields, we can give it manually, but how about 100 fields? I think the question is more about how do you create a metadata for huge data structures?
Yeah. So I always prefer to use an example file. You can do that for JSON, CSV, and if you can get the client, or assuming you have a client or your employer or whoever's giving you the requirement, if you can get them to give you that example file, that's even better. So that's the way I do it.
I think I agree to that, because even I do the same way. Always find an example file and then create metadata from it.
Yeah.
That's good. So Parth, how to sort a particular element values listed as array in a given payload using DataWeave?
I'm not sure what the
this
question.
is. It's like how to sort a particular element values listed as array in a given payload using DataWeave. I think he's just asking how to sort stuff.
I think there is a sort function.
Yeah, there is a sort by. I think the only problem I have seen with sort by is it's difficult to sort by more than one field. So if I have like an employee array with an employee objects and I want to sort first by their last name and then probably by their birth dates, those kind of combinations I have seen it's difficult because sort by always takes only one field name. So it always first sort by first name, and then if you give again a birth date, basically you will lose your first day. So I always get around that combination is I create a unique value out of those two columns. So if it's the first name and the last name, but it's tricky, it won't work every time, right? Like if alphabetical and numerical is causing problem, it won't work 100% all the times, but sometimes it does the trick.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
Yeah, so I usually do that thing. Rohit is saying, how does log work in DataWeave? Only at the build time, or can it be used in preview window of transform message?
It's a good question. I honestly don't know. I would, if it's gonna be apparent in the preview, you're not going to see the log message anyway, because the preview is just showing you the output of the transform, and the log message doesn't affect that in any way. That's kind of the point of why they made log that way, where it returns the value of whatever expression you're logging.
Right. And I think for the other part, whether it's only at the build time, I don't think it's at the build time. It's actually for the runtime debugging. When your code is really running in the runtime and you are logging something, it's helpful for that.
It's like the same thing. Like your sysout print statements are not going to show if you're not running the code.
Running that, exactly. So it's all at runtime, right? Nothing at the build or the preview. So Shashank says, if we are using map operator, basically we are looping a collection. Is there a way wherein we can exit this looping based on a programmatic condition, like we do it in Java using break? I think probably the break, he's looking for something like a break functionality.
No, the best way, the only way you could do it is you'd have to filter out whatever you don't want to map over, or like partition it first and then just loop over one of them. But there's no way to break. It's just gonna keep going.
I think I agree there. Like for keeping it clean, I would first filter the payload for whatever condition that whatever objects I don't need, and then at the end I will do the mapping.
Yeah.
Right. That even keeps your code clean and neat.
Yeah, because if you're going to use break, I would use if there's other ways to do it, and if break is like the best way, then use Java.
Yeah, it's something different then. Yeah, but yeah. So can we debug with debug mode in DataWeave step by step like we do in Java code?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. And I'm not sure if that's coming. So the best thing you can do is log. That was one of the thing, when I was trying to learn DataWeave, I was like, man, it'd be awesome if I could just step through whatever's going on and map and filter and figure out how this is going. But it'll just step over it every time.
Right, and I think the log function is helpful. I remember in one of my use case where I was mapping a file which had like hundreds of thousands of rows with like more than 50 fields in it, and I was mapping it, and like somewhere between 400,000 line was giving problem.
Sounds like
without log you cannot figure out which line in that whole huge file is causing that, but when you start putting a log statements, then you can pinpoint to the exact record which is causing you that problem. So it is powerful and it's useful. So yeah, unfortunately, like he said, there's nothing for step-by-step debug for it. You talked about how we can use log as a clever workaround. Is there an example or explanation of what on your blog or anywhere else for logging?
Wait, can I go to the YouTube?
Oh yeah, I thought you were looking at just open the public YouTube page. Hold on,
I just didn't want to look at myself for 45 minutes.
Yeah, just make sure you turn the volume down, otherwise it will generate an echo.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So,
So to answer the question, I have a blog post that goes into how to use log. So I'm finding the YouTube link right now.
I just pinged you on the chat, on the Hangout
Okay.
chat.
And now I just need to find my blog.
That's funny.
Okay, let me turn down my volume real quick.
Yeah, otherwise it will be echo, like your mic and the YouTube sound, everything will be echo. Did you find it? I just pinged you. Oh, okay, so there it is. Tips on the debug Google, right?
Yeah, so that actually goes over like multiple different debugging concepts, and log is included, but one of them is really centered around that concept of taking expressions and being able to substitute them with whatever value you're using. And a really effective way to do that is to take these. So you might have a bunch of nested calculations, like a function that calls a function with the result of that, that calls a function with the result of that. Really effective way to break that up and see what each thing is doing is just to assign those intermediate calculations to variables, and then you can output those variables in a map. And that's a way that you can debug. And like was being asked earlier, you can use the preview for that as well, which is cool.
Right, and I think that is definitely helpful, because in my case, I can another usage of log was like inside the log, not really inside the log. I was I believe inside the log I was calling another lookup flow, and there it was a debug. So I had like a weird combination of logging, because I don't want my logger to log 400,000 lines for every file. I wanted it to log only if I turn on the debug logging mode for it, because every time logging all those 400 would cause like a lot of log data, right?
So have you found a way to
inside the log
have you found a way to put on like conditional logging in DataWeave?
Not in the DataWeave, but the way I was doing was like I was using a lookup function instead of log, and I was calling another flow, and that flow was having my logging log logic, and it used to just echo the same payload that I send it to it. But now inside that my mule flow, I had a logger which was set to debug mode, like only debug level. So if I turn on the debug for that particular category, then only it would log. Otherwise, in like 99 out of 100 executions where everything was good, it won't log anything. But if 101 fails, then I can turn on the debug and I can reprocess that huge file, and then I can find at what particular record it breaks.
Awesome.
So that was like a different use case for that. But yeah, I mean, that's useful. Useful. So something Parth said, it's not related to DataWeave, but does Mule has a component using which I can call more than one service at the same time?
Yeah, that would be the scatter gather. And basically you configure that. It looks like a choice router, and on the palette you kind of do it the same way. You drag multiple connectors and they stack on top of each other. The difference is there's no condition. It's going to execute all of them simultaneously.
Yeah, but I think that's right. That's cool. So that's the end of the questions. Any more questions, guys? I didn't see any other questions. So yeah, that was otherwise, like, that presentation was awesome for me. It was all the like behind the scene concepts of all the things that you usually do in the DataWeave. Like, I have written a very complicated logics with DataWeave, but it, like, you never think about, okay, how it must be doing behind the scenes. Like, you just keep doing the stuff and look at the output and be done with it. Sometimes you go in that mode, like, I just want to be done with it. Like, I just want to write this script and I want to be done with it. So
that's how it goes a lot in the beginning, because it's something that's so new that
yeah,
it can be frustrating, but
that's true.
keep doing it.
Yeah. So okay, maybe one last one. When we are iterating map, we can do things like map ID dollar when some condition. We can also use when with otherwise, like map ID this continue.
So
Now the difference. ID dollar we are using, and and okay.
that's interesting. So when I'm actually not 100% sure, but I think if you wrap the ID colon $ in parentheses, first if you just have a key and a value, it's syntax sugar for an object constructor. So you'll basically have an object inside of an object, but no key to the nested object. So I'm not sure what's going to happen there. It might bomb, or it might just coerce it into a single object.
No, I think the key there is the parenthesis is a dynamic evaluator, right? So in his first example, where it is in parenthesis ID colon dollar when some condition, so that evaluates in a way like if the when condition turns out to be true, that key value pair ID colon dollar will be out will be available inside your result object. If that some condition is false, that whole key value pair will not exist in your output payload.
Gotcha. Yeah, I totally
In a position with like where ID colon dollar when some condition otherwise this, so there the ID key will always exist in the output, only its value will depend on when or the otherwise part of it. So ID will always exist in the second situation, but in first situation whole that key value will be omitted if some condition doesn't met. So it's that
Yep.
dynamic. It's similar to if you are having a dynamic key name where you are putting a string inside the double quote string in a parenthesis. It's for that only. It's a dynamic evaluation for that. Hey Jason, good to see you. You're joining us from Canada. I've seen it. Yeah. I think that was Shashank's question. And Nikhil is asking, what's the difference between map and the map object? Any use cases for map object?
Yeah, definitely. So map is always going to work on an array. It's going to take in an array, and it's going to output an array as well. Does not matter what's inside the array. Map object is different in that it only works on objects, so key value pairs. So the difference being, like with map, you're dealing with like a single element at a time, but with map object you're dealing with two, the key and the value, and you can modify both of them. Some good use cases for those. Oh man, it's kind of hard to think of ones on the spot. I don't even know if I put any of these in the practice exercises, which I definitely should, because map object is important. The first thing that comes to mind with map object is if you're trying to if you have a complex data structure where you have objects and arrays and they're nested and whatnot, you have to use map object if you want to create a function that modifies everything from the top level to the bottom level. And I know that's kind of vague, but I just can't think of anything more. Can you think of anything?
Yeah, I think one example I can think is, let's say I have an employee object, not an array, okay, just an employee object. And one of the attribute in employee object is a social security number. And you want to mask that social security number, right? So since it's an object, what you can do is like let's say employee is the variable name. You can do employee map object, and then inside the script, if your key name is social security number like SSN, then you can modify the value for that particular key. So if you want to operate at the key value level on an object, then you would use map object, compared to if you have an array, like you said, if it's an array is an input, you choose map for it.
I think you could also apply what Shashank was saying, where you can use those parentheses in the conditional expression to essentially filter out keys in the object as well. But I think there's a filter object that you can do that with too. So
yeah, you can do that too, right?
In DataWeave 2, but in DataWeave 1, you're stuck with a map object for doing that.
Yeah, no, that's true. So
ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so for Arjun, yes, I believe the presentation slides. Josh, you are gonna send me the link to share presentation slides, right?
I will.
Yeah.
I'll send one in the chat right now, and then
yeah. So when I send the recording link, I can include that slides link again in there. What else? Map object I have used for a tricky mapping to convert keys to values and values to keys. Yes, so that is right. I mean, there are tons of applications for map object and map. Once you start writing the scripts, you will find them useful there.
Also, if you haven't learned how to use reduce, I highly recommend it.
I was definitely impressed by the blog post that you wrote about reduce. It has so many different examples or data sets that you can apply reduce on, and the result set of all those operations is really amazing. I mean, like the way you can use reduce on the objects to just accumulate your like values and create a single value out of it.
Yeah,
that's really, I would recommend everyone to look at the reduce functional examples for that.
I remember for the longest time I was always like just staying 10 feet away from reduce because it was just so confusing for whatever reason. The reason why I wrote that blog post was because I wanted to better understand how the thing worked. And when I got to the end of it, I was like, the realization I came to is you can implement filter and map using reduce. You can just view almost all of these functional programming tools, not all of them, but like a fair amount of them that work on arrays as just a different take on a reduce function. It's, I don't know.
No, that's no, I agree. It's too powerful, reduce function. When you might get initially, when you start with it, you might get confused with, okay, where do I put accumulator, left or right? And if it is an accumulator, is a string or number, how do I concatenate? How do I like convert that value into a single output? So it's scary to begin with, but then you realize the power.
The thing that was tricky for me was coming back to the whole immutable data thing, where when you have reduce with that accumulator value, you have to create a new value every time that gets used as the accumulator. You can't just like append onto an array and that's it. That array that you've appended the value onto actually has to get returned from that function to be used again by the next iteration and reduce and eventually returned.
Right. So maybe I can ask one question to you. In all your DataWeave implementation, what was the most challenging transformation you have done, or the most interesting transformation you think you have?
Oh man,
I know that's tricky.
That's so tricky. I usually don't keep track of them unless I think it'll be like a good question to put on the
blog.
Practice blog. Yeah. So there's one that I always remember though, and I don't remember what the exact specific was, but this guy I work with named Marcos asked this DataWeave question in our Slack channel, and I remember just being so close to getting it for like, I worked on it for like 3 hours, and I was just so close the whole time. And when I finally got it, I felt like that was when everything really clicked for me with DataWeave. Like that was, I was actually sitting at a pizza shop working on that.
That's nice.
But yeah, but I don't remember the specific ones. I always love when I get the chance to use reduce. I also really like whenever I can use pluck and group by.
Oh man.
I think the 3 of those are probably my favorite functions to use. Specifically pluck. I think pluck is just a lot of fun. There's a lot of applications for that.
I think group by is the only use case where I really used pluck. Like I always use that one only for that purpose. Like if I want to group by something, that's like, okay, look for it.
They go so well together because, right, you get that object with the key.
Yeah.
And everything groups, but like all you want is the grouping. You don't care about the key, and it's fantastic for that.
No, that's right. Yeah. So what's Shashank saying? When we are using map operator, is there a way to use the value of particular iteration, say the third iteration as we can?
Yeah, yeah, there definitely is. So map takes in to the function that you pass to map. It takes in 2 parameters. You get the value itself, and then you get the index. So as long as you specify a second parameter, you'll be able to keep track of what iteration you're on, and then when you're on the 3rd iteration, you can execute some kind of logic and not execute that logic on any other iteration.
Right, but I think the important point to remember there is you cannot skip processing a particular record. Even if you don't output anything, it will have a placeholder in your output array, right? Yep. Even it could be an empty object. So just be careful there. That's why initially we were saying if you don't want to process anything in a map, it's always better to filter that out first and then apply your map. Just to stay clean on that.
And this is a tip I heard. I don't remember. I think I saw this tip in like the Mule Slack channel, and I never thought about it explicitly, but it seems so obvious now. If you're going to do a filter and a map combination, always do filter first.
Yeah, I mean, why would you map over 1,000 objects and then filter 900 out of it, right?
Sure, I used to do that before I read that.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like just get rid of whatever you don't want and then process what you really need. Yeah, I think that's interesting. So let's see if we have any more questions. Otherwise, I think we are good. Okay.
So,
oh,
what's up, Raheem? That's a familiar face from LinkedIn. So in Mule 3, you don't have access to the iterate. Assuming iteration and map object, you mean the index. Look at that. Yeah, you don't have it in DataWeave 1, but in DataWeave 2, you actually have 3 input parameters for the map object function that you give it. Obviously, the key and the value, and then that 3rd one is the index. And you can just get to that with the $3 or however you structure your lambda.
Right, but again, like with map object, it's a key value pair, right? I mean, why would you want index for there? It's a key value pair, so you are iterating on a collection of key value. If you want to be crazy with the DataWeave 1, you can apply pluck on object first, that gives you two collections, then iterate over keys collection, you have the index, and you get the value.
And then you got to bring it back into an object. So you'd use reduce.
Yeah, I mean, you can use reduce, or you can see, yeah, see, he's facing that issue with DataWeave 1.0. So you can, I mean, you can try that on the object. Use the plug function first. That will give you array of keys and array of values. So just use array of keys and then iterate over that, and you can always get the value back from the other collection using the index. So you can do that. And there are different ways to achieve things, but it just some are like not so beautiful hacks.
It gets
Yeah.
messy in DataWeave 1.
On one.
Yeah.
So do you ever write like a Groovy or Java function when data view transformations get complex? Do you write that?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. But I think it depends. Like I always default to DataWeave if typically. Now, this doesn't happen so much anymore, but in the past, there have been clients that just had a lot of Java expertise in shop, but didn't have any Mule devs. And when that's the case, I try not to lean too heavily on DataWeave because they're just not going to be able to effectively maintain the code that I'm writing. So it really just depends. So unless there's something with the client, I'm always going to opt for using DataWeave just because you can typically get away with writing a lot less code to do the transformation than if you were to do it in Java. I'm not very familiar with Groovy or their support for functional programming, but yeah, depends on the client.
I think in DataWeave 1.0, I used to write global expressions just to call some common utility functions which are like, let's say, available in Apache Commons, and I don't want to implement those. So, and there was no way to call Java directly from DataWeave. So just to have a wrapper over that, I would write a global function, call that function, and then that global function, I call it from my DataWeave 1.0. But with 2 now, you can just call your Java classes directly.
Yeah, that's nice.
All right.
I feel like we're talking about the olden days.
Right. Yeah. No. True. That's nice. So what else? DataWeave 2.0. Yeah, and one I think the big benefit of DataWeave 2.0 now is it's the expression language for Mule 4, right? So you get to use that throughout your applications anywhere you want.
Yeah, I think that was a really good call on their part.
Right.
Like, why would you want to force someone to learn 2 languages when you can get by with 1?
I mean, I can be frank here, and like the instances of using DW function in my Mule 3 were probably more than I actually using any MEL function. So I used to prefer using a DW function and then writing a DataWeave script in that, instead of trying to prepare some MEL function or MEL script in it. I never liked the MEL part of it. So as soon as they made it like an DataWeave as a default one, I was the happiest person. Yeah.
I was on a contract while the guy who I do Mule Made Easy with, he was on vacation, and I took up his code base, and he did that all over the place. he would call the DataWeave function from the expression language, and I'd never seen anybody do that before. But when I was looking at his code, I was like, this is a lot cleaner than if there was the Mel stuff everywhere.
No, I would agree to that, because I used to do the same thing, like in Mule 3, all DW functions, because I used to like the simplicity of DataWeave script, that I can the same, if I want to do a function, implement a certain logic using DataWeave script versus the MEL function, the DataWeave was always cleaner. So I always used to prefer like DW, and then within that write your script and then done with it.
Yeah.
So I think we have a few there, and DW1, but I think the variables using are created with the initial value.
I'm not sure. The using part is throwing me off because using is a keyword, and I'm not sure if you're referencing that or variables themselves.
No, I believe he is referencing the variable that we create using keyword, like using in bracket a is equal to b, and then this map inside that. I think he meant, can we change the value of a? I don't think we can change the value of a. You cannot change the values of variables once they are initialized.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah.
So there's no using in DataWeave 2. They have they've made it so that you can create, I'm pretty sure it's a closure, but you can essentially create a scope where you can define a bunch of variables instead of, okay, yeah, he's talking about the using keyword. You can define a bunch of variables just as you would in the header of a DataWeave file, as opposed to using.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the rule is once you initialize them, you cannot change. So anyone tried to lead DataWeave code dynamically?
Yeah, I had a guy that used to work at MS3 was loading DataWeave code from a database and running it dynamically. I never looked at his code, but I think the trick to doing it is using the read function. And so basically, you would take in, like, let's say the payload was a string, and that string represented some DataWeave code. You would use read payload, and it would evaluate that code.
Yeah, and the other way to do it, if the script is so huge, and if you are reading that script in a string variable, you can actually pass that variable to DW function, like DW in bracket, you hold that script file from wherever you are reading, and it would essentially do the same thing as read. It will execute the script within that file with that content and give you the output for it. I mean, that is I have seen that a common use case when you have a lot of dynamic data weaves in place and you want to reuse your flows and only the data weave part is changing. So
Yeah.
even I have done that, like get a file, run it through DW and get the output for it. Yeah, I think his use case is same. It's in the database and exposed via the HTTP.
Yeah, it should work. I'll see why it wouldn't.
It does work. Just take a look at the read function or the DataWeave function and pass in your script content to it, and both methods should do it. I don't think DW exists in DataWeave 2 or the Mule 4, so it would be read function only.
Yeah.
But if it is DataWeave 1, you can try with the DW.
We're using.
Oh man, no, I am not an IntelliJ user. Sorry.
I used it very briefly, but not for Mule. I don't think they support it.
I believe there are some community. I think today morning only I was reading Patrick's blog. He published one blog today or yesterday about Mule kernel, like new community edition. And somewhere in that blog, he did mention about doing development on IntelliJ for community edition. You don't get the Mule UI editor for that. It's like you will have to hand code all the XML part of it. You won't get anything from Studio. But I believe there are some community plugins in IntelliJ which supports running Mule applications using that.
Yeah, so there's a plugin.
So something. But yeah, I mean, I never used that.
I like IntelliJ a lot, though. It's nice.
Yeah,
Just,
I mean, I have seen people using it, at least for Java part of it, but I am like from day one Eclipse user, so
yeah,
it's
same.
still it's like
Deep in Eclipse.
it's yeah. I mean, it's like all the Eclipse functionalities. It's in muscle power. Like you don't have to think about anything when you are doing in Eclipse. Your fingers just work on the keyboard. But
Yeah,
for IntelliJ, I tried, I believe, earlier this year, and I had to. I mean, but obvious, I never used it, so I had to struggle with that.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that's right. Okay, there is a Mule plugin for it. I think what 10. Ideally, we still have like 30 minutes as per plan, but if there are no questions and there's nothing, let's see. Did we miss any question? I'm just scanning through the question just to make sure we didn't miss
Maybe
anything.
we'll put the own. I'm just trying. Not sure what the question is though. If we're using read URL so that we can reuse DataWeave scripts across the application, except for loading the script which includes I/O, is it good if we might need it across? Are you talking about performance?
If we are using it.
Miguel, I've never used DataWeave in Designer before.
I played with it. I can say I played with it, but as it's personal preference, I always prefer Studio over Designer. And I think like Designer is if you want to just quickly try something and you don't have Studio right in front of you, then I would go there.
Yeah.
But from functionality point of view, I believe the DataWeave Designer and the DataWeave Studio should still be same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't look good. Is there any blog you have written to understand case feature? I don't know. So look at the Shashank's one. He put something. The case function. Is there any blog you have written to understand case feature in Mule?
Oh, is there using case pattern matching? Yeah. No, but I can put one together. It's essentially the same as the pattern matching that they had in
Java.
DataWeave 1.
Mm-hmm.
Don't use the word case, and you just separate each case by a comma. But yeah, it's a really powerful pattern matching is something that you see in functional languages. That's really powerful. So
Okay.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone used DataWeave for custom validations, XMLs which are not covered through schema validation?
I've
XML. Go ahead.
I've definitely used DataWeave as a validator before, just because it's pretty easy to get through a payload and check some things. The difficult part winds up being separating, like for example, if you want to attach certain messages to certain errors and give something back to the user, I've found that that can be pretty difficult. And so what I typically do instead in that case is I use Java to do those validations.
Yeah. And I think one of the use case I had was the XML was using, I believe, DTDs. And DataWeave, if you send an XML with a DTD in it, it at least DataWeave 1.0 it used to fail. So I had to remove the DTD syntax or the DTD declaration from the input XML before I pass that whole XML into DataWeave for mapping. So it's different, probably not what Manish is asking, but it's one of those weird scenarios. If you have an XML that uses DTD instead of XSD, probably it won't work. You may have to like remove the DTD declaration before you pass in the XML to DataWeave.
So I have a question for you actually. With DataWeave 2.0, I don't remember where I read this. Does it have XPath or is it XSLT?
It has XPath, not XSLT.
Okay.
And XSLT is something that I never liked. Just for the record, I never liked XSLT. I mean, it's like it's so I never liked that code.
I don't like XML, so I naturally don't like XSLT.
Yeah. So yeah, we have done in Java as well in Mule 3. Yeah, that's right.
I've also found that validations have a tendency to be used. So I shouldn't say all the time, but in my experience, they get used across more projects than a transformation would. So sometimes Java makes sense because it's just so easy to package up and use it.
That's true, right? You cannot. I think it should be this way. Like you need to choose it based on your use case and what functionality you are looking for, what is the efficient way to implement that, and what skill sets you have around. And based on that, just choose your approach. And I would say like go for it.
Yeah.
Right.
I had an application where it was just I had to validate a bunch of CSVs, and we needed to dig down into like what row and what column the error was on and give them a meaningful error message.
Wow.
And I tried to do it. I tried to make sense of it in DataWeave for like a day, and then I just wound up doing it with Java instead because it just didn't. The Java solution was so clear compared to the what I was coming up with the DataWeave one. It just didn't make sense to use DataWeave for that.
Right. I mean, that's why it's all based on use case and what you are doing and how you want it to be. Choose what makes sense.
Because once you're comfortable with the language, you'll be able to like reasonably identify what's going to work for DataWeave and what's just going to be a headache to either build or maintain afterwards or both. Yeah.
Output is
I wasn't around for early 3, Jason.
Oh, I mean, of course, if you compare that with data mapper, maybe you will like XSLTs, but like with I mean, I would prefer DataWeave, or if it is XSLT, I mean, something else, maybe Velocity or anything else. I mean, there are a bunch of other things too. Like I even had Velocity-based templates, which were complex and easy to do. So just use the Velocity and run that through Mule, and you get it. So those were. I mean, I would prefer that route. XSLT would be something last thing that I would do.
Don't want to add any more XML.
Yeah. So DataWeave 2.0 supports end-to-end streaming when output is XML. We noticed that it was not end-to-end in DataWeave 1.0. I think it was, right?
I think. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, the only place where DataWeave 1.0 does not do streaming for the output is if your output type is application/Java. If you are outputting a Java, then it writes the whole structure in there. But for anything else, it is always this thing. It's always streaming. The default one is always stream, but I guess with 3.8 onwards or 3.9 onwards, they added a new flag on the DataWeave, where you can specify, I forget what that attribute is called, but there is an attribute which you can control what should be the output. Should the output be in the stream, or should the output be the actual resolved object? So that was there in Data 1.0. I don't know why you didn't see, Manish, that XML was not streaming. And DataWeave 2.0, it's completely different because of those reusable streamings and all those, right? So everything is now streamed there in DataWeave 2. DataWeave 2, in fact, in Mule 4, everything is like streaming, reusable streams, repeatable streams everywhere. Yeah. Is there any plans to conduct an webinar on custom policies? Sure. I mean, why not? I can take that as something to plan for, Arjun. Not really, like, I think custom policies, the overall policy setup or the API gateway, I think, is completely a different and big topic to discuss about. So yeah, sometime in the future, I can look for that. Awesome. Let's see. What do you think? What will finish first, the 20 minutes or 10% of battery on my laptop? Do you ever consume DataWeave output streams just for logging? Wow. Never ever do that. Never ever consume your streams just for logging. Never do that. Not just for DataWeave, I would say for anywhere, even in Mule 3, if you are working on something and if your payload is stream, don't convert that payload to string or anything just for logging purpose. I mean, you should find something else if you really want to, but converting streams for logging purpose, I always found that as not a good idea.
I've seen that in code before. And I think what happens is people add in those loggers and just they dump the payload for
Yeah.
deep purposes while they're coding, and they forget to take them out.
Right. And
they're stuck there.
Right. So while you read the next question, maybe let me grab my power card, because I think it's gonna run. Give me 1 second.
So apart from DataWeave 2.0 fundamentals, do we have any webinar on advanced? I didn't have any plans on it. That depends on.
I'm back.
You didn't hear what I thought your speaker was on.
No.
Apart from DataWeave 2.0 fundamentals, do we have any webinar on DataWeave 2.0 advanced?
I think we should have. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, that's always good to have. So we will look for something for that. We'll plan for it. See, anything more? So when you usually write your DataWeave scripts, do you usually write them inline, or you always put them into different DWL files? Why?
Unless I'm going to reuse them, I always put them inline. And the reason being is just because I've had some bad experiences where, like, there was a time where I was actually trying to put all of my DataWeave scripts off into separate files. And what I don't remember how I did it, but I wound up deleting like multiple scripts doing this somehow. So I'm not.
That was a user error.
I'm not trying to talk anybody out of doing it, but whatever habits I had built up using DataWeave made it so that like I was just deleting scripts randomly. So I always leave them in line, just like as a safety precaution against myself.
That's a user error.
Yeah, like I'm saying, like, probably my own fault, but I just leave them in line.
Right. No, I think I put them into external file mostly because I always want to write like a test case for specific to my DataWeave script. And in that case, then I can just write a test flow, drop a transform message and reference the same DWL file and then just write test cases specific to my script, provided my script has to be that big that it's worth writing test cases for it. It's not like a single line script.
So that's what everybody should do.
Right. I mean, like definitely, if it is a if my script is not a single line simple one, I don't do that. But if it is a complex one, I always write a test case very specific to that script, and that is where then I want to put that script into DWL file so that I can reference on both sides, like actual project. But that adds a risk. That is where the risk is. If you delete a transform message from here, and if you probably delete that file also, so just be careful.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I. But if you have source control, it's not a huge deal, and if you're committing in reasonable intervals, one of the things that's interesting about testing DataWeave is a lot of times your data transformations are the most complicated part of your flow. But I also, when I'm looking at code, sometimes they're the most sparsely tested parts of people's code as well. And I always found that really ironic because there's usually a lot of complexity embedded in there, and to not test it and to test other things like, you know, like a choice router, which might make sense, but just make sure you're testing your DataWeave stuff pretty heavily.
Right. I think the challenge usually with that part is the output of DataWeave will always be a huge object. And if you are using MUnit 1, there wasn't anything where you can compare whole object to object, right? I believe I forgot, like this one guy, he wrote a pretty good MUnit extension for MUnit 1.0. It's like a custom connector which takes object as an input, and you can give it a sample object and it compares whole object to object, meaning it will verify each property on the object. And if in the employee object, if date of birth is not matching, it will throw an error. It will throw an assertion error saying employee dot date of birth does not match with this value. So it is so nice in 3.0.
I've never heard of that. That sounds awesome.
I even used it in my project because I liked it. And like I said, I always want to test my DataWeave. Before that, what I used to do was, like, after my DataWeave, I used to use like a pluck on there on my object, and then it will convert that into key value pair. Then I used to loop over that using like a sort of for each in there inside my test. And then within that, I used to assert those values. But still, before that also, I used to verify whole object, so that, like, if I have 100 fields and different mappings on it, I verify that one. But that was interesting in there. I don't know in MUnit 2 if there is a way, because they are using Hamcrest matchers there. So probably it has some better pattern matching. Maybe. I never tried that in DataWeave 2 now.
I remember getting like a JSON string out of a DataWeave and then trying to that to an actual other string somewhere else, and like I'd be missing a space somewhere or something. And
I think I did that few years back. And then I think there is one post on my blog about how to test that part. The way I did was I had exact same situation. I had a JSON coming out of my data weave. So I put that my original file into DWL. So in my test class, I have a data weave transform component referencing that DWL. And after that, I converted that JSON again into an Java just to verify the values of it, not the structure of it, but the
Yeah.
values of it. Like it has the expected attributes, it has expected values and all that. So if my Java object is as per expectation, my JSON will be. So like
Yeah.
that, I mean, it's some give and take you do there, but it was still better than having nothing.
Better than a raw string comparison.
Yeah, it's better than, because raw string comparison I had issues. It's like if I am outputting a text file on my Windows and actual test case is running at the end on the CI/CD on the Linux, those are the different issues you run into, space and the line ends and all that. So I always like remove all the spaces and then compare the content, but it's weird. So it's not what Ishwar is saying, not TW. When you initiate a variable in batch step, how to get the value or variable outside the batch flow, because in Mule4 anyway set variables works for everything. That's diff batch. Oh, yeah, that's the link Rahul put in there. For the link that Rahul put in, that is the set object mapper was I was saying. And for Ishwar's question, Ishwar, I don't think that the concept behind the batch variables had changed in Mule4. I believe even though they get rid of the record variables in Mule4, the concept of variable inside a batch is still the same. It is still scoped to your individual record processing. I don't think you can get that variable outside of your batch step scope. It's just like you don't have to read about record variable as well as set variable now. In Mule4, it's only set variable, but underline it is still the same scoped variables for your individual batch steps. Awesome. Wow, that was a longer discussion. We still have like 7 minutes.
I'm looking at this library. This is really cool.
I mean, it is cool, and I'm saying it because I really used it with the complex structures. And I believe, I don't know, like, I think Dave or someone posted that link, and I did ask him, like, why don't we put this functionality in the core M unit? Because that is so much required functionality. Like,
Yeah,
you would want to compare all objects, right? Instead of just string and values for that.
sure do.
It is, I mean, for a minute one, that was like a so much saver for me too. I don't know, in a minute two, probably because of the Hamcrest matcher, it may have some advanced stuff there to use. But if not, I would do something like this for that too. Okay, guys, I think it's 6 minutes and I don't see any more questions. Yeah, I think we can wrap it up now.
Alrighty.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Josh. It was really good to have you here. Like, we had a great discussion, presentation, even the question answers discussion was really good. Maybe next,
Thanks for having
yeah. No, always it's my honor. Like it's really always good discussion about DataWeave. So maybe I should plan for DataWeave 2.0 advanced now. maybe in the next next session we can look for it. But yeah,
Yeah.
otherwise,
Maybe up
sorry.
2019. Maybe up sometime in 2019.
Oh yeah, December. I mean, I don't think December is all around the holidays and everything. Okay, so usually see the OS level file locking mechanism in Mule 4 file read connector is uses an OS level file locking mechanism. I think that is still it's is it for new updated file connector? That is all internal to connector. Connector will take care of reading the file, and it does use the locking mechanism there. I mean, I don't get the question because that is all inbuilt functionality of connector. Yeah, I think apart from that, I believe we are good.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Today morning. I know for some part of the world it's morning. Like if you guys are joining us from India, it's definitely a morning there, and it's almost nighttime here. So have a good morning. Thank you. And yeah, thanks, Jason. Happy Diwali to everyone. It's a festival of life, festival of light in India. Josh, so it's lights, crackers, and everything.
That
It's a
sounds
big
awesome.
in India. Yeah, right. Cool. Thank you. So with that, I think we will sign off from here and talk to you guys in next live event. Have a good night. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.